She vanished after cheer practice, and the school locked down its silence. 20 years later, what workers found in a janitor's closet shattered everything. This wasn't just a disappearance. It was a cover-up buried beneath the gym floor. You won't want to miss this story. But before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a video like this one. Lena Marsh sat alone in her cramped studio apartment, surrounded by yellowing manuscript drafts and half-drunk mugs of cold coffee, when the latest rejection email lit up her screen like a flare in a fog of self-doubt. This one wasn't just another form letter. It came from Professor Alan Griggs, her old mentor, the man who once told her she had a voice like wildfire. Now, years later, with his editorial power consolidated behind a prestigious literary journal, he dismissed her novel in one curt sentence: not publishable. Too sentimental to be taken seriously. The phrase stuck like gum on the bottom of her confidence. For weeks, Lena had poured herself into that story, raw, aching prose about girlhood, grief, and the silence that follows Lawson to see it boil down to a backhanded insult by someone who once applauded her courage made something snap. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in that quiet, seismic way that only the deeply wounded understand. She closed her laptop and stared out the window, past the fire escape, and into the soft glow of the bookstore across the street. That place, with its handwritten staff picks and second-hand hardcovers, had once carried her childhood dreams in every cracked spine. She remembered reading her favorite novel for the first time there, kneeling between aisles like it was a sacred ritual. And now, that version of her wide-eyed, hopeful, reverent, felt unreachable. But buried under the burn of humiliation, a slow heat began to rise. Not rage, not revenge, something quieter, steelier. She reread the email one last time, not to torture herself, but to study it like a relic. It wasn't just rejection, it was erasure. A declaration that her tenderness didn't belong. And that felt like war. So she pulled open a drawer, took out the notebook she'd always reserved for dreams too fragile to commit to Word docs, and wrote something she hadn't dared to put in ink in a long time. I will not be silenced by men who've only ever written about women they've never understood. Her hand trembled as she wrote it. But the page stayed steady. She didn't know what came next. But she knew she wouldn't quit. Not now. Not ever. There were years when Lena's life was measured in coffee refills and closing hours, in notebooks filled with sentences that would never be read, and characters who spoke louder than the people around her. She'd written on receipt backs during her barista shifts, on her phone during bathroom breaks from waitressing, and on the backs of napkins while riding the last bus home. The cafes blurred together dimly lit refuges where she could sip cheap Americanos and pretend she was part of something literary. Even if all she had was the glow of her laptop and the hope that maybe this draft would be the one. She remembered the early days when a flash fiction piece had landed her a finalist spot in a contest that never quite made it to publication, but earned her an email from a professor who called her a raw nerve in the best way. That same professor now passed judgment with the surgical coldness of a critic who'd forgotten what it meant to bleed on the page. Over time, the encouragement dwindled. Writing workshops turned cold rooms full of chin-scratching men who called her metaphors romanticized trauma and suggested she write something less domestic. When she once read aloud a piece about her mother's breakdown, a classmate had muttered, "Another sad girl story," and the room laughed, not cruelly, but dismissively, as though her pain was cliché simply because it was hers. But even as her voice was sidelined, boxed into the corner of emotional, the stories kept arriving, persistent as dreams, urgent as hunger. She wrote about girls who ran barefoot through grief, women who screamed underwater, mothers who left, and daughters who stayed too long. They weren't plot-heavy or clever or trimmed for male approval. They were tender, unapologetic, and real. And though no editor had yet wanted them, they poured out of her with a clarity that didn't ask permission. There were nights she cried over rejection letters, crumpled entire drafts, and swore she'd never write again, only to find herself hours later starting a new scene, one hand gripping a mug, the other shaking over the keyboard. Even when no one was reading, the stories kept coming, like breath, like heartbeats. She didn't write to be applauded. She wrote to stay alive. And in that quiet war between giving up and going on, Lena was still writing, still here. The janitor swore he'd locked up by 10, same as always, but when Marvintha graveyard shift security guard rounded the far end of Lincoln High's parking lot at 12:37 a.m., the gym lights were still humming overhead like stage lights waiting for an actor who never arrived. It wasn't the first time something like that had happened, but there was a particular weight to the silence that night. The kind that pressed against your skin and made the hair on your arm stand tall. Marvin stood at the double doors for a moment, staring through the glass at the gleaming hardwood floor below, polished to perfection, utterly still. The scoreboard blinked 0 in red, like eyes that couldn't look away. He tapped his flashlight against his thigh, debating whether it was worth calling it in, or if this was just another wiring hiccup from the aging circuit breakers. But then he heard it soft, measured, a footfall so faint it could have been a settling pipe, or his own breath turned paranoid. It came again, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing just out of sight behind the bleachers. Marvin stepped back. His training told him to investigate, to walk the perimeter and announce himself. His gut told him to leave it alone. Eventually, he did neither. He made a note in the log, lights left on in gym, likely janitorial oversight, no further activity detected, and went back to his rounds. But the image stayed with him all night. Those bright lights, glaring in a building that should have been asleep, like something had refused to leave. It wasn't until weeks later, when whispers began to circulate about a missing girl cheer practice, last seen in uniform, never made it to her ride, that Marvin's stomach dropped. He pulled the log from that night and stared at the entry, the timestamp, the dismissiveness, the footsteps he hadn't followed, the lights that stayed on long after the crowd had gone. Years later, when the school board reviewed every file and every statement, his would be the one circled in red. And Marvin would sit in his recliner every night and remember that sound, the soft patter of footsteps echoing off linoleum, and wonder if what he'd heard wasn't a ghost at all, but a girl trying for one last time to be found. Frank Malloy had been pushing a mop down those hallways for over 20 years, and he liked to say the school spoke to him through the squeak of old pipes, the hum of vending machines, the faint chorus of sneakers, and shouting long after the last bell. His routine never changed. Locker room first, then gym bleachers, then offices, always in the same order, always finished by 10 p.m. When the girl went missing, Frank showed up to work the next day like it was any other Tuesday, punching in with his thermos and ham sandwich in hand. When the police came asking questions, he answered them all with the flat tone of a man who'd long since grown used to seeing messy kids and messy lives pass through his halls. "Didn't see her," he said. "Didn't hear anything either." He talked about how quiet the building had been, how the cheer squad left around 7, how the showers had been dry, and how her bag wasn't in the locker room. Calm. Measured. Too calm, the detective noted later, because there was something peculiar in the way Frank recounted the details, not like a man remembering, but like one reciting. He offered small things nobody asked for, which stalls had toilet paper, which lights had flickered, that someone had left a soda can behind the vending machine. It gave the impression of honesty, but also misdirection. When investigators asked about the janitor's closet, Frank's brow barely lifted. "Just supplies," he said. "Nothing but mops and bleach. But the odd thing was this. Frank usually locked that closet every night, had always been meticulous about keeping it secure. That night, security footage would later show he forgot, or said he did. And while the cameras didn't catch him entering it, they also didn't show him leaving the gym at all between 8:45 and 9:30, when he claimed he was in the outer hallways. The logs didn't match. Nor did the silence in his voice. As the investigation deepened, teachers whispered that Frank had always kept to himself, always ate alone, always seemed to know more than he let on. One even recalled how he once joked, "You can bury anything in a school if you know the timing." No one laughed then. And no one would laugh again when the closet he insisted was empty turned out to be holding a truth, soaked not in bleach, but in something far harder to wash away. Denise Hale wasn't the type of mother who waited by the phone. From the moment Brianna didn't come home, she turned the quiet ache of fear into a war drum, pounding louder with every hour that passed. She printed flyers until the ink ran dry, and the tips of her fingers were permanently smudged black. She stood outside gas stations with a photo in each hand, asking strangers if they'd seen a girl with dimples and red sneakers. She turned down interviews with morning shows because she didn't trust the news to tell the truth with urgency. Instead, she held vigils in front of the school's glass doors, lit candles in the cold, and parked her car directly across from the gym's side entrance, where she swore she'd wait until someone slipped up. She ate fast food off the dashboard, napped under a blanket in the passenger seat, and kept a spiral notebook filled with names, times, and suspicious details if no one else thought they were suspicious. Teachers offered her prayers. The principal offered her a meeting. But Denise didn't want comfort. She wanted cracks. She wanted the version of events that wasn't rehearsed. She memorized staff schedules, observed which janitors took smoke breaks and when, which doors were left unlocked, and who avoided eye contact when walking to their car. When police told her to go home and rest, she said, "She might be locked in a room not 50 feet from here, and you want me to nap?" Her voice got raw, her face thinner, her tone sharper by the week, but her presence never wavered. Denise was there when the power flickered during a storm and when the cafeteria lights buzzed at dawn. She was there when cheer posters were taken down and replaced with sympathy banners. And she was there the morning she noticed the janitor's truck wasn't in its usual spot. She took a picture of the empty space, just in case. People began to avoid her, afraid she might ask them something they couldn't unhear. Some whispered she'd lost it. But Denise didn't care. She knew what a mother's gut felt like when truth was circling just out of reach, and she wasn't about to be polite about it. She knocked on doors that didn't open, stared through windows she wasn't invited to, and carried her daughter's photo like a badge of war. If the school wouldn't give her the answers, she'd stay parked there until the building itself confessed. It was a whisper that barely made it past the doorframe, caught between the rustle of hallway traffic and the indifferent drone of morning announcements. A sophomore, bright, anxious, always clutching her books to her chest, stayed after class one day and told her English teacher something that wouldn't sit still in her throat. "I think I saw Brianna," she murmured, barely audible. She was behind the bleachers. She was arguing with someone in a grey hoodie. The teacher froze, unsure whether to press for more or let the words hang in the air like wet laundry too delicate to wring out. The girl didn't name the person. She said she didn't recognize the face, only the shape of the anger. It was the kind of argument that wasn't meant to be heard. Brianna's hands were up, not in surrender, but in refusal. The grey hoodie turned toward her like a threat, disguised as casual. That's all she could remember, or at least all she would say. Within days, her parents pulled her from the school, no warning, no farewell, just a sudden withdrawal and a silence no one questioned. Her locker was emptied by a counselor. Her name was scratched off the cast list for the spring musical. When asked, faculty said it was a family emergency, but Denise Hale remembered. She'd caught the girl outside the office once, staring at a missing poster with the same haunted stillness she wore now. Denise had tried to speak, but the girl turned and left like she was escaping something, not someone. Rumors stirred, none confirmed. The hoodie was dismissed as common, the argument reduced to hallway gossip. No one logged it, no one followed up. The girl's name vanished from attendance sheets like dust swept into corners. But Denise never forgot. She wrote it down in her spiral notebook, circled it 3 times. She tried to find the family but hit closed doors and disconnected numbers. Something about the speed of that transfer scratched at Denise's ribs like truth trying to claw its way out. Years later, when an investigative reporter tracked the girl down through alumni threads, she declined to comment. "I said too much already," she whispered through a crackling phone line. Her voice had changed, aged by time and fear, but the echo was the same. One sighting, one moment, one detail buried under silence, caution, and the fear that telling the truth might be more dangerous than keeping it. It was written in jagged, hurried scrawl, so crude it barely clung to the tiled wall above the row of lockers, smeared with what looked like a mix of rust-colored grime and adolescent spite. "She never left," it read, the words tilted slightly, like whoever wrote them had one eye on the door. A freshman girl was the first to see it that morning, too frightened to say anything until after third period. By then, a gym teacher had already scrubbed it off with bleach and an old rag, muttering about kids who think trauma is something you graffiti for sport. But the message lingered in memory, in rumor, in the air that clung to the locker room like sweat after a double-header. Word spread fast, as it always does in places where truth hides between half-whispers and hallway glances. Girls began avoiding that corner of the locker room, dressing faster, eyes flicking to the mirror, then away. Some said they felt watched. Others claimed they heard something move in the supply closet when no one else was near. One girl threw up during PE and begged to switch to independent study. None of this made it into reports. None of it made it past the threshold of serious inquiry. Denise Hale, who had begun documenting even the faintest whiff of rumor, learned of the graffiti from a cafeteria worker's niece. She stormed into the school demanding to see the wall, but by then it had been power washed, repainted, sterilized into silence. The janitor shrugged. "Just kids being cruel," he said, not meeting her eyes. But Denise knew cruelty. This wasn't mockery. This was a message, a footprint someone had tried to wipe clean. And its timing, months after the search had gone cold, just as the school resumed business as usual, felt too calculated to ignore. She jotted it in her spiral notebook beneath the timeline, circling the date, the hallway, the time it was discovered. She never left, not ran, not disappeared, not taken, left. The word echoed in her like an alarm clock underwater, muffled but urgent. She began spending more time outside the school in her car, listening to student chatter, watching patterns. She noted which teachers always changed the subject, which students walked faster past certain halls. She wasn't imagining it. Something remained something loud enough to scribble on a wall, yet quiet enough to be erased before anyone could hear it scream. The camera mounted outside the girls' locker room was meant to be the school's silent witness, watching over hallways long after the final bell rang, and the last pair of sneakers echoed down the linoleum floors. But when investigators finally checked the security feed for the night Brianna Hale vanished, they found nothing but static dead air, an empty digital void. "Camera was down," said the school's tech coordinator, flipping through a clipboard with forced casualness. "Maintenance work, power supply issue, should have been back up by Monday. But Brianna disappeared on a Thursday, and by the time anyone noticed the camera had been unplugged, the entire weekend had passed." No backup, no secondary angle, no cloud archive. It was as if someone had planned for silence. Denise stood in the cramped security office, staring at the blank screen like it might blink back to life, like her daughter's silhouette might reappear in ghostly flicker, turning a corner, chasing a friend, or being followed by something no one wanted to admit was possible. She didn't believe in coincidences anymore. Not when her daughter had been there inside that building. Walking those halls and now wasn't. The timing was too perfect, too orchestrated. When she asked for service records, she was told the maintenance logs had been overwritten. Routine update. System clears itself every 30 days, the man explained, as if the erasure of evidence was just another function on a checklist. But Denise wasn't done. She pulled yearbooks, dug into social media posts from that week, even contacted a junior who worked part-time for the AV club. He remembered something odd, that the janitor had asked him for a spare power cable that same week, saying the hallway camera was flickering weird. The student thought nothing of it then, but now? Now it felt like a thread. Denise tugged. Hard. She started asking more questions about who had access to the control panel, who signed off on maintenance, why the camera facing the other side of the gym, the trophy case, was working fine the entire time. And while none of it brought Brianna back, each silence, each shrug, each bureaucratic deflection carved the shape of something real, a shape of avoidance, a shape of fear. Someone didn't want Brianna seen that night. And someone had made damn sure the one eye that could have watched her was closed when she needed it open. For over 20 years, the narrow janitor's closet, wedged between the boiler room and the back wall of the old gym, sat forgotten, padlocked, and unremarkable. Its chipped metal door blending into the scuffed cinder block like a birthmark nobody looked too closely at. Students passed it daily, unaware it held anything more than mops and mildew. Staff called it Frank's closet, a leftover relic from when Frank Malloy roamed the halls with his keys jangling like spurs. After his retirement, no one questioned its existence. It was just another sealed door in a school full of ghosts. That changed when the renovation crews arrived, tasked with gutting the east wing for a new science lab. They pried the door open with a crowbar, expecting to find old cleaning supplies or forgotten sports gear. Instead, they recoiled. The closet hadn't just been locked, it had been sealed. A plastic tarp lined the floor. Dust-covered shelving sagged under the weight of time. In the corner, tucked behind a cracked utility sink, sat a cheerleading duffel badge, its zipper rusted shut. A shiver ran through the foreman's spine. He called the police. When detectives arrived, they catalogued everything. The bag, its contents, the faint discoloration on the concrete below. They found a cheer uniformed in black, with the school's emblem faded to a ghost of its former self, and a shoe with dried mud still clinging to the sole. Beneath the crumpled hoodie was something else, a name tag from a pep rally in 2001. It read Brianna. Denise Hale was brought in to confirm. She didn't cry when she saw the badge. She simply nodded, like her body already knew what her heart had suspected for decades. This was where her daughter had ended, not in the woods, not in some far-off state. But here, in the same building that had once echoed with her laughter and cartwheels, it wasn't just a closet anymore. It was a tomb that had waited quietly, patiently, for someone to care enough to open it. Questions followed like thunder. Who had locked it? Who had keys? Why had no one looked inside during the dozens of safety checks over the years? A janitor's closet had become the heart of a crime scene, and everyone who'd ever turned a blind eye to its silence was now under scrutiny. For the first time in 20 years, the locked door was open, and the shadows inside finally had to answer. The sealed plastic bin was wedged behind rusted shelving like it had been intentionally hidden, pushed to the back of the janitor's closet as if to bury time itself. When the renovation crew forced it open, The scent hit first old plastic, mildew, and something metallic that made one of the workers step back. Inside, folded as if packed in a hurry or with reluctant precision, was a cheerleading uniform, red, black, and stiff with age. The letters across the chest, once bold and bright, had dulled into something ghost-like, but the name stitched on the inside tag left no room for doubt. Brianna Hale. The air in the room thickened. Beside the uniform lay a cracked cell phone with a long dead battery, its case still sparkling faintly with rhinestones shaped into the letter B. There was duct tape, wrinkled and yellowed from age, and a Lincoln High student ID card with Brianna's face staring blankly into the room, as if she'd been waiting. Officers called to the scene grew quiet. They didn't speak as they photographed the contents, logged each piece, gently lifting them like relics pulled from a tomb. Denise Hale was summoned again. This time, she asked to see the bin alone. Inside that dusty room, she sat on a metal folding chair while the detective stepped away. She ran her fingers over the stiff fabric of the uniform, the way she used to straighten it before pep rallies. When she saw the phone, she didn't try to turn it on. She only whispered, "I told you I'd find you." The student ID lay near the bottom of the bin, partially water damaged, but Brianna's name still clear. It was the same photo used for the yearbook that never featured her senior portrait. For years, Denise had begged authorities to search every inch of that building, to check every closet, every storage space. And every year, they reassured her everything's been looked at. But no one had opened this bin, no one had thought to, whether by neglect or intention, the evidence had been hidden in plain sight. It wasn't just a collection of items, it was a truth that had been boxed up and shelved, as if the building itself had been guarding its shame. The discovery reignited the case. Fresh headlines, renewed interrogations, and a town forced to confront the ghosts it allowed to linger. And in the center of it all, a uniform that had once symbolized school spirit now screamed of betrayal. The bin, now a crime scene unto itself, was transferred to the state forensic lab under seal and escort, guarded not just for evidence, but for what it now symbolized: 2 decades of failure cloaked in dust. Technicians worked through layers of grime and fibers, brushing through the sediment of time with sterile gloves and hearts braced against what they might find. Swabs taken from the uniform collar, the cracked cell phone case, and the inner lid of the bin revealed a mix of DNA profiles, as expected from something untouched for years. But one partial strand held. It wasn't Brianna's, it wasn't her classmates, it wasn't even from someone on faculty in 2001, it belonged to Frank Malloy, the same janitor who'd claimed he saw nothing that night. The same man who'd given polished statements and passed every early polygraph with mechanical calm. Malloy had retired in 2009, moved south, and slipped beneath the radar like a leaf drifting into a different stream. He was living quietly in a retirement community in Florida, going by Frankie, and working part-time at a hardware store. When authorities arrived, he greeted them without resistance, wearing a polo shirt and orthopedic sneakers. His first words were, "I knew you'd come eventually." Back in town, word spread like a virus through the same halls where Brianna had once walked. Students turned, parents stared at yearbooks. Teachers revisited old meeting notes. Denise Hale sat silently through the arraignment, her daughter's cheer bow in her lap like a folded flag. Investigators now believed Malloy had access to that locked janitor's closet long after the case went cold. And the DNA wasn't just incidental. It was embedded in the fabric, the tape, the corners of the phone. It wasn't oversight, it was proximity. He had touched those things, handled them, possibly packed them himself. Why he did it, or what role he played, was still unclear. But the physical evidence whispered what no one could prove 20 years ago. He knew. The arrest sparked outrage, media storms, and a wave of reopened depositions. Those who had shrugged off Denise's suspicions now avoided her eyes in the grocery store. Students who once giggled in the locker room now called their own daughters home early. And through it all, that one matching profile lifted from beneath 20 years of silence spoke louder than any denial. The truth had waited in the dust, and when it spoke, it pointed its finger with steady, irrevocable aim. The tapes weren't meant for public release, but in the hush of the DA's office, they played like a ghost speaking through an old vent. Frank Malloy sat hunched under fluorescent lights, the lines on his face cutting deeper with each minute. No lawyer. Just an old man and a recorder, his voice cracking not with remorse, but the fatigue of a secret too heavy to hold any longer. At first, he denied everything claimed coincidence, bad luck, false science. But the DNA, the uniform, the timeline they wrapped around him like vines, pulling him back to a night he'd hoped the world would forget. Slowly, his tone shifted, not apologetic, not grieving. Just resigned. He said Brianna had stayed late, frustrated over a chemistry grade, upset that a teacher's office was locked. He offered to help, said he knew where the spare test copies were kept. She followed him. That part was clear. What came next stumbled out in fragments, raised voices, panic, a shove that went too far, and a neck that struck metal where tile met wall. He said he didn't mean to kill her. He said it over and over, like a prayer that might rewind time. But his next steps were not the actions of an innocent man. He said he moved fast-dragged her, silent now, into the janitor's closet behind the boiler room, that he sealed the bin because it felt final, like closing a door. That every year after, he'd waited for the knock, but it never came. Not when the flyers went up. Not when Denise sobbed on the local news. Not when students whispered her name into mirrors at sleepovers. Malloy lived 20 years in the calm of a man who'd survived the storm, and now the tide had finally returned to collect him. On tape, he said he wasn't evil, just scared, just weak. He said it like that made it better. For prosecutors, the tapes were gold clear motive, opportunity, and confession in his own words. But for Denise, it wasn't clarity. It was cruelty. Every syllable he uttered was another second her daughter had been reduced to a hidden bin in a forgotten closet. Another moment erased, stolen, boxed up, and left to rot. Malloy's voice will never echo in a courtroom. But in those tapes uneven, wheezing, cowardly, it lives on as the final testament to what silence buys when no one's looking. The crawl space beneath the gym hadn't been touched in decades, just a forgotten cavity sealed off by time and silence, where only rats and rumors had wandered. It was Frank Malloy's last breadcrumb, muttered through cracked lips after hours of interrogation. Check under the west wall near the pipes. When authorities lifted the warped floorboards and peeled back the rotted insulation, the air shifted heavier, sour, thick with secrets that had fermented in the dark. One officer gagged, another whispered a prayer. The skeletal remains were curled into themselves, wrapped in a janitor's jacket, as if death had tried to offer comfort where humanity had failed. Beneath the bones, moldy strips of duct tape clung like dead snakes, and beside the remains lay a silver hairpin, bent, rusted, but unmistakably the one Brianna wore on picture day. Forensics would confirm what Hearts already knew. It was her, Brianna Hale, the girl who never left school, who had cheered her last routine and vanished before the final bell. The gym, once echoing with squeaks of sneakers and the rise and fall of chants, now stood still its walls, holding back a scream no one had heard for 20 years. The janitor's jacket bore Frank Malloy's name patch, the stitching faded but legible. As the coroner lifted what was left of her into a fresh body bag, the crowd gathered behind the police tape, silent. Denise Hale stood among them, her fists tight at her sides. She didn't cry, not at first. She stared at the soil, at the dust in the beam of a flashlight, and then she nodded once, sharp, definitive, like a gavel striking wood. In that moment, the mystery unraveled not with drama, but with the quiet weight of truth. There would be no appeals, no more whispers in school hallways. No more wondering what had happened behind the locked door, no more faded posters on telephone poles. Just the truth, raw and late. Brianna had never left. She had been hidden, buried not only beneath wood and brick, but beneath years of inaction, of missed signs, of a system too willing to call a girl a runaway and move on. But now, her name would be spoken not with questions, but with reverence. The crawl space would be sealed, this time not to hide a crime, but to honor the life it had wrongfully swallowed. Candles flickered in the soft dusk light, scattered like stars across the school courtyard as hundreds gathered in silence, students, teachers, parents, and strangers who never knew Brianna, but carried her story now like a heartbeat. The school marquee that once announced sports victories and prom dates now bore a single line. We remember Brianna Hale. The gym, her last known place of laughter and movement, was draped in violet ribbon, and at the center of the lawn stood the newly built memorial garden, lavender and marigolds framing a polished granite stone etched with her name, birth date, and 5 simple words. She was always worth finding. Students filed in with silver-threaded initials stitched onto their jackets, subtle but defiant, a mark of solidarity no administration could scrub away. The air held the scent of flowers and candle wax, but also the heavy perfume of reckoning. A teacher read excerpts from Brianna's old essays, her dreams of becoming a vet, her belief that kindness was the bravest form of rebellion. Every line fell like a dropped pin on marble. No one shifted. No one coughed. Even the wind paused. Denise Hale stepped forward last, holding the only photo that hadn't faded a cheerleader mid-jump, eyes fierce with joy. She didn't deliver a grand speech. Just said, "Thank you for finally seeing her," and kissed her daughter's name on the stone. That was enough. In the weeks that followed, every classroom opened its day with a moment of silence. The principal authorized an elective on local history and student rights. And the cheer squad, once a blur of pom-poms and practice smiles, became something sharper, prouder, braiding silver into their hair, forming routines that ended with arms raised high. Fingers pointed to the sky. Not because they were asking for justice, it had come late and splintered, but because they were claiming space. Brianna's space. Her absence had become a presence, shaping how students looked at each other, how staff double-checked locks, how silence was no longer seen as harmless. The school changed. Slowly, yes, but tangibly. And in the evenings, when the garden lights flickered on and lit her name in amber glow, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like a promise. That no girl's story would ever again be erased to protect convenience. That memory, when honored, becomes a form of resistance. And that Brianna Hale, once hidden behind a locked door, now stood in light, in stone, in thread, forever part of the school she never got to leave.